Just a few weeks ago, I did a video that you may recall titled Arch Linux is objectively the best Linux distro. In this video, I was going through a survey hosted by the... Why did I click that frame? Hosted by the Arch Linux subreddit, trying to find out what Arch Linux users want from Arch, what they do with Arch, what they like about Arch, and all this fun stuff. And now the results are in, and you know what? Arch Linux is the best Linux distro. Now, it was the main option of the survey, so you know what? Winning by default is still the best kind of winning. No, but seriously, let's have a look at the results of the survey. There is this write-up here by the moderators of the Arch Linux subreddit. If you'd like to go and read that for yourself, I'll leave it linked in the description. Also, I will leave the full survey results linked down below as well, so if there's anything I maybe don't cover, any of these specific numbers I don't show, that will be down there as well. Now, firstly, let's talk about a couple of potential flaws and design choices with the survey. Whilst there was a lot of respondents, that being 3,923, you didn't have every single person necessarily answer every single question. Most people did answer everything though, so I think it's about, at the lowest point, like 3,700 respondents to a question. With that being said, most people are from my community, most people are from the Arch Linux subreddit, so, you know, they are Redditors. Whether this is representative of the average Arch Linux user is really hard to tell. Yes, a lot of people did fill this out, so it's very likely, but there's a lot more people that use Arch Linux. Also, whilst there were questions about your English ability, most people filling out the survey are going to be native English speakers. They are Reddit users, or they're people from my community, and I know my English is kind of bad sometimes, but most people here are either native speakers or highly confident in English. Are the results going to be the same for someone who is Spanish who doesn't know English, or maybe someone who is Chinese? Again, it's impossible to say. Also, everything is self-reported. This isn't some data collection system, so people can fill things out wrong, people can lie to be funny, things like that, but presumably, most people are being honest in the way they are filling this out. So let's jump right into it with the languages of people in the survey. Surprising absolutely no one ever, most people's primary language is English, 45.1%, with 10% being German, 4.7% being Spanish, 4.7% being Russian, 4.5% being French, and then Polish, and then Portuguese. If you've been in any FOSS-related community, you've probably met people speaking any of these languages, primarily English, but also a lot of people speaking any of these. And of course, being a survey in an English-speaking community, most people say they are either native, highly skilled, skilled enough to do things in their everyday life, or they're good enough, right? You're not amazing at English. English isn't the thing you speak all of the time, but if you need to speak to an English speaker, you can do it. And also surprising absolutely no one ever, being a survey about Arch Linux, most of the people answering the survey are using Arch Linux itself. They're not using Manjaro or Catchy or Endeavor. They're using Arch Linux. And of course, the second biggest category are people using something Arch-based, and then Windows. I don't know why these people are answering the survey, but they're here as well. I guess so. There's a lot of people that they use Arch, but their main system isn't Arch. Or they use Linux, but their main system isn't Linux. Maybe they need to use Windows for work or Windows for school, and then have a secondary device, or they're dual booting, and then also using Linux. One thing that really surprised me about the results is the range of experience using Arch. I would have expected it to be fairly skewed towards those first couple of years, say 1 to 3, or maybe those first 6 months, but it's actually pretty even. So the biggest category is 1 to 3 years, second biggest is 3 to 7 at 21.4%, then 6 months to a year. So this is your very new users. Then we have less than 6 months, even newer users. And this is your wizards. More than 7 years. And then you have the, oh, I've tried it, but I don't use it now. Or I've never tried Arch. Of course, being a survey about Arch, not many people are in this category. And not many in this either. But the fact that there's this many people who stuck around and this many people who are starting to get into Arch shows that there are a lot of people who are finding out about Arch, giving it a shot, and many of those actually stick around. But there is that cutoff after 7 years, and I feel like the reason for that is, as of 7 years ago, Linux, just in general, was a much less friendly experience. Keep in mind, Proton only started in 2018, so there's going to be a lot of people who started after Proton who can now actually game on their system. I've talked about this before. I know a lot of people don't really care about video games, but for a lot of other people, having that as a use case, having a single system that you can play games on, is actually really important. Now, you'll notice that the next category of questions only have 123 responses or something around that range. These are the responses from people who said they were not using Arch Linux. I don't really think these responses are as exciting, so we'll skip past them to the same version of the question, but from people who said they do use Arch. Now, which graphical environments have you tried? This is not what are you currently using or what is your favorite. That one is going to come a little bit later, but what ones have you actually used? Number 1, KDE Plasma. Number 2, GNOME. Wow. What a surprise. The 2 biggest desktops are the 2 most tried. Crazy. Third is Windows. I didn't like that Windows was included in this survey, but Windows is here as well. Fourth is something that you also shouldn't be surprised about. A lot of people aren't happy that it's fourth and it's as big as it actually is. Hyperland. Then XFCE, Cinnamon, i3, Mac, again for the same reason as Windows, I don't like it being on the list here, Sway, LXD/LXQt, Mate, Cosmic Alpha. I am very happy that this is here. You may call me a cosmic shill, but I am very happy that a lot of people are actually giving it a shot during the alpha state. I'm sure that during the beta, a lot more people are going to try it, and then during full release, more people are going to try it. Whether they stick with it or not is not really that important, but actually seeing what the desktop is like. Is this something that fits my workflow? If you were surprised about anything on that list so far, I don't know what to say. Go on Reddit. Go speak to people that use Linux. This is the least surprising ordering that I have ever seen. Now for the very important one, the very controversial one. What is your favorite graphical environment? Number 1. Again, shouldn't surprise anybody at all. KDE Plasma. If we're talking Fedora or Ubuntu, I would like to actually see those numbers. I would like to see a big survey done of Fedora users, especially after the KDE version becomes an addition and is actually treated at the same level as Workstation. But it shouldn't surprise anyone that most people want a Windows-like experience, want a very customizable experience, especially if you're on Arch. Arch is a distro about basically building your own distro. If you want to get some work done, but you also want to build your own environment, KDE just makes sense. However, if you have a lot more free time on your hands, Hyperland is the second place favorite desktop. Again, makes a lot of sense for Arch, with a lot of people being on Wayland, which you will see a bit later. It's pretty much the best window manager choice. If you don't want to use a full desktop environment, there's not really a better option right now. The Mer ecosystem is going to become something eventually. Sway is fine, but not great when it comes to customization. Hyperland just makes sense. And then, of course, it's still a big desktop, and there's still some people that just don't really care about that much customization, but still want to do things at a lower level. Third place is GNOME. Fourth is Sway. Fifth is i3. Then Nexus CE. Then DWM is actually surprisingly big. I would have expected it to be quite a bit smaller. The thing that I'm really surprised about, though, is the amount of gap between KDE and GNOME. I didn't think it would be that much bigger on Arch. Again, this is specifically Arch users, so what that breakdown would look like on something else, again, entirely unclear. Now, I'm going to show you the least surprising thing you will ever see. What kernel do people use? Wow. Most people use the standard kernel. Oh my god. You install the Linux package and you get the kernel. Wow. However, the weird thing is the number of people using both Zen and LTS is very, very close. Now, I don't know the reason for this, but I have a feeling that it might be because people just want a backup kernel and just pick one of them. Obviously, there are Zen users. Obviously, there are LTS users. But these feel like backup numbers with how balanced they are. The next one, though, is catchy. A lot of people really like this kernel. A lot of the changes are finally making their way upstream, but I've had a lot of people bug me about using that distro. But along with this being unsurprising, the thing that is also unsurprising is the... Jesus Christ, there's so many, like, fill-in answers. Some of these are the same thing. Some of these are just people writing something random. I don't currently use Arch. Why are you even... Whatever. Moving past that one. What have you installed Arch Linux on? Mostly on desktops and laptops. Laptops is slightly ahead, and I imagine this is because a lot of people, firstly, don't have a desktop, they only have a laptop, and a lot of people who do have a desktop likely have an old laptop that maybe they were going to replace, maybe they're going to chuck away, and so they're like, let's just install Arch on it, like, let's install Fedora on it, let's install some distro on it, no point chucking it away, it's a perfectly fine laptop. Or they have Windows on their main system because that's the main thing they do work on, and then Linux on the laptop. It just makes sense that a lot of people would use it on a laptop. The smallest category here is on a server because White Psychopath is running Arch on a server. I know some people do. I am not one of the people. Next one is in a virtual machine. Most people have probably tried Arch in a virtual machine, right? Even if they don't use it actively, which is probably most people, 48.4% have at least tried it. What really does surprise me is the amount of people with a dual boot, which shares a drive with another OS, dual boot configuration, but Arch's drive itself, and then a mono boot. I don't know how these are balanced. I actually have no idea how these are balanced. Following up from the last one, most people use Arch on a desktop at 57.8% and on a laptop 37.6%. So this actually tells something slightly different from the last one. Most people have tried it on a laptop over a desktop, but they prefer it or they mainly use it on a desktop over a laptop. This could imply that there's a lot of people that first try Arch on a secondary laptop. When they get more used to it, when they get more used to Linux in general, then they move it over to their main system. That would make a lot of sense to me. Now, if you asked an Ubuntu user or a Fedora user whether they prefer using a GUI or a command line to solve some generic task, doesn't really matter what it is, I would imagine most people would probably say they prefer using a GUI. On Arch, however, to the surprise of basically no one, most people prefer using a command line tool over a graphical tool, 65.2% versus 34.8%. Now, this is a weird question because it very much depends on the kind of task. If we're talking about file editing, for example, like text editing, yeah, I prefer a command line. I'm just going to use Vim. Or if I want to go just browse my files, I'll probably use a terminal file manager. But if I want to do something like I don't know, browse the web. I'm not going to use a command line browser, so it really depends on the kind of task. And wow, most people on an open source operating system prefer Firefox. Wow, who would have ever guessed that? 57.9% on Firefox. Second place is another browser based on Firefox. So probably your Florps or LibreWolf, things like that. 9.7% on Brave. I know there's a lot of people that don't like Brave, that don't like crypto, all that stuff, but Brave is a very popular Chromium-based solution, and if you don't want to run Chrome or Chromium itself, yeah, it makes sense. I have Brave installed, I use Brave. I also have Chromium installed as well. The next biggest option is Chrome at 5.4%. Now, I don't know if this is actually supposed to be Chrome or people using Chromium answering Chrome, because that seems awfully high for Chrome itself. Now, what is your favorite terminal emulator? Personally, I use Alacritty. I like it. It's good. And so do a lot of other people. But it's not the biggest terminal on Arch. That would actually be Kitty. I am surprised this is that big. I know there's a lot of people that talk about Kitty, but I didn't think it would be that big. Now, second place kind of makes sense, right? Because remember, KDE is the biggest option people go with. And there's a lot of people that seem to really like console. When I did my Ghosty video, you have no idea how many comments about console I got saying, oh, console does this, console does that, why don't you use console? I can see why now. I can see why. And then next is Alacritty. What do you think is next after that? Well, there is another big desktop, and a lot of people are just perfectly fine with the GNOME console. And then Foot. There are a lot of Feet fans, a lot of Foot fans on Linux, as you can tell from the GNOME logo. The Foot logo is a Wayland terminal. It is very lightweight, is very fast, and it's certainly got its die-hard fans. You don't really hear people talking about it as much, but anytime you ask about a terminal to use, you're probably gonna run into a Foot fan somewhere along the way. Now let's talk about the big one. Wayland versus Xorg. There are a lot of people that make a lot of noise about Xorg, but on Arch specifically, how many people actually use it? You would be very surprised by this number if you're an Xorg shill. 79.6% prefer a Wayland session. This is on Arch, where you have the complete choice of what desktop you want to use. 20.4% on X11. Now, I understand why this is still so high. There are a lot of people that have been using a window manager, whether that be BSPWM, AwesomeWM, i3, and it's just fine, right? They don't want to change from it. There isn't a window manager available on Wayland that does what they want. Or they're a user of the really popular desktops, not the biggest ones, but still quite popular, like Cinnamon, like LXDE, like Mate, like Cinnamon, Mate, LXDE, XFCE. I forgot about that one. And some of those do have a Wayland session in process, but Cinnamon, XFCE, it's still very much a work in progress. Mate is doing a weird, different approach. So for those people, they can't really change it. And then there is the contingent of people who rely on some accessibility feature, whether that be key jumping around the screen, whether that be global hotkeys, any of these other little things, and just cannot use Wayland in its current state. And for some of those people, some of those things just probably aren't ever going to be possible, which means what are they going to do then? I don't know what they're going to do then. We'll have to find out when distros start dropping the package. Now, what about hardware? What are people actually using? Well, the CPU of my main system, AMD. AMD. If you look at any hardware surveys, it's going to be Intel. Intel is still by far the biggest. But AMD is a really compelling solution nowadays, especially with the past couple of Intel generations that had some, pretty rough issues, to put it lightly. But when it comes to the graphics processor of the system, it's NVIDIA. It's NVIDIA. Right? Yes, people are going with AMD on the CPU side because AMD is absolutely crushing it on the CPU side. But a lot of people, even though they might know that NVIDIA is a worse choice, at least traditionally, on Linux, NVIDIA is still by far the biggest GPU manufacturer. NVIDIA has gotten a lot better on Wayland nowadays. But AMD is still a big choice because, again, traditionally, AMD has just been a much better option with Wayland. It's just been a much better option in general because of the drivers, not having to fiddle around with getting them installed because you have like Mesa and all that fun stuff. This makes sense. Intel integrated and then AMD integrated as well. So these would be your most likely laptop users. I doubt there are many desktop users who are going without a dedicated GPU. I'm sure there are some, right? Don't get me wrong. There are a lot of people out there who don't game or do 3D work or anything like that who are perfectly fine like this. But if you're on Arch, you're probably relatively tech inclined, whether that's going to be 3D modeling, gaming, or anything else that, compute work that might make sense to have a dedicated GPU. Now, how did you install Arch? Me personally, I used the traditional manual installation method because I installed it, a couple of years back, and that was kind of the best way to do it. The Arch install script, I think, existed then, but it was still, a bit flaky. Nowadays, though, it's actually pretty good. It recently got a redesign, and it's very convenient. And it shows because 32.5% of people used the included Arch install script. Of course, most people did the standard CLI installation. That just makes sense. If you look up how to install Arch, this is probably what you're still going to get. If you go to the Arch Wiki install guide, that's what it's going to tell you to do. And of course, with there being a lot of people using an Arch-based distro, there were people using a different install script or utility as well, like Calamares on Manjaro and things like that. Or they might have their own install script, things like Luke Smith's post-install script. Now, being someone who doesn't really pay that much attention to drive technology, I'm very surprised by the next one. I didn't realize M.2 and NVMe drives were this ubiquitous. 77% on M.2 or NVMe, 17.9% on an SSD, and 3.4% on a mechanical hard drive. This makes sense. But I would have thought this would be way bigger. I thought this would have been maybe like 30 or 40%. I have my root drive installed on an M.2 because it's just faster, right? But like, I know they're very cheap now. And if you want one that's just big enough to install your root, like it's only a couple of dollars. But I did not expect it to be this much. Now, what tasks do you use Arch for? Most of this isn't really that exciting, but I do want to highlight this person right here. At least they're being honest, right? Totally fair. The rest of this, yeah, people use computers for web surfing and video playback and personal productivity and coding and gaming. Wow, who would have expected that? Even with how many resources are out there to use Arch Linux, like the Arch Wiki, my videos, tons of other people's videos, there's still a lot of people out there that say, oh, Arch is difficult to use. Arch is hard. Why would anybody use Arch? But to my surprise, most people don't really find it that difficult. Now, to be fair, these are people who say they are using Arch. So it makes sense the people using Arch say Arch isn't that difficult. It kind of filters out the people who say it's hard. But the people who do use it say it's fairly easy and don't really run into problems that often. That's at 55%. Second from that is moderate. These are the honest people, where from time to time they do run into problems, they do need to go find some documentation to fix something. It's not often, it's every couple of months, but occasionally there is an actual problem. 10% are the people who are just absolutely lying. They are not often stumped by obscure problems. Maybe they don't have that much installed. Maybe they actually are being honest here. But I have a feeling that, like, moderate and fairly easy, maybe something in between that, are the people who are a lot more honest. Unless these people have been using Arch for, 7 years. Maybe the other people have been using it for a very long time. But there is a contingent of people that use Arch that do think it is very difficult. But I think, like a lot of things, it's the vocal minority, but also people who just don't actually use Arch. It's not that hard. It just involves reading comprehension, which I guess, to be fair, a lot of people do struggle with. Now, when it comes to AI, a lot of people have very vocal opinions. They are either very in favor of it or very against it. But what about the Arch Linux user? I think using an AI system to help set up or troubleshoot Arch Linux is generally top somewhat beneficial at 40.3%, somewhat harmful at 31.5%. So most people are somewhere in the middle, right? They think it might be good, they think it might be bad, but they don't have a very strong opinion on it. Then there are the people that say it is very harmful at 20.4% and very beneficial at 7.8%. This doesn't surprise me. I would be surprised if this wasn't representative of just the general people that talk about AI. Most people aren't really in favor of it one way or another. They kind of just think it's good or bad, depending on the thing. And then the people who don't like it very much don't like it. Now, whilst Arch may have been my first daily driver distro, I am under no illusion that this is the case for most people, and the numbers say this as well. Was Arch your first Linux distribution? 86.9% no, 13.1% yes. It's kind of shaped like Pac-Man as well. Good coincidence. So, yeah, this makes sense, right? A lot of people start on something like an Ubuntu, on a Fedora, probably not Gentoo, on one of these easier to use distros, or maybe something Arch-based, and then eventually try out something else, and the logical endpoint of being a Linux user is using Arch. Now, you could go further and use Gentoo, but nobody's got time for that. Now, whilst the whole M.2 thing may have surprised me, what doesn't surprise me is the root file system that people use. Wow, ext4, the default, is the biggest. And wow, Btrfs, the only other file system people actually talk about, is the second biggest. Crazy. And do I even need to talk about the repos that people have enabled? Of course, most people have core, the one you literally need to function, extra, that you literally need to function, and then multilib, which you mostly need. There's a couple of 32-bit packages you want, and yeah, this makes sense to have here. I'm surprised how many people use an unofficial repository signed. This is most likely going to be chaotic AUR users. This is by far the biggest one. I'm sure there's a couple of others out there, but chaotic AUR is very popular for people who just don't really want to build AUR packages, but still want a Git release. The next one is a very funny result, but also very much unsurprising. Where do people get their supplementary packages from if they're not getting a package from Pacman? A lot of people really like the AUR. They use it quite often. Some of them use it sometimes. Not that many people try to avoid it, and there's a few people who don't use it at all. This is a great goal to have. The AUR, should be used, but should be used with care. Over on this side, we have not many people using something else. Also makes a lot of sense. App image, we have a lot of people that don't use it at all. We have a lot of people that avoid it. We have people that use it sometimes, but not many people that use it a lot. I have a couple of app images because, there's just random things out there where the only thing that makes sense to install it from is an app image. Flatpak is pretty balanced. A lot of people using it sometimes, a lot of people not using it. Some people trying to avoid it, some people using it a lot. Then we have Snap. Snap, which breaks the layout of the graph because there's so many people that don't use it at all. And nobody responded that they use it a lot. I'm not gonna say that I'm fully responsible for this. However, I'm definitely partially responsible for people not liking snaps. Now, considering the amount of time that people have used Arch, this makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of people, 35.7%, that have 1,000 to 1,500 packages, 20.3% at 1,500 to 2,000, 16.8% at 700 to 1,000, 9.7% at 400 to 700, and then there's the people who've had an Arch install for a very long time and haven't refreshed things for a bit. 2,000 to 3,000. And the very few percent of people who are very clean with their system with less than 400. And of course, people using Arch Linux and answering surveys about Arch Linux and being in an Arch Linux subreddit probably are going to be pretty satisfied with Arch Linux. I wouldn't put too much weight into this. The only way to get a proper answer for this is asking a more general Arch Linux audience, but I wouldn't be surprised if most people are pretty satisfied. I haven't really got any problems with Arch. Arch kind of just stays out of my way, which is exactly what I want. So what do you think about the results? Is there anything in here that surprises you? Or is it pretty much just what you would expect? For me, a lot of it is pretty much what I'd expect. I've done surveys about Wayland in my community before, gotten very similar results, so that's not that surprising. The thing about M.2 drives, definitely, I'm very surprised about that, but a lot of the rest of it is pretty much in line with what I can see. But let me know your thoughts down below. So, if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out Patreon, subscribe to LiberaPay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and go use Arch, by the way.
Like this.